Welcome to Cultivate, a Veritas Academy podcast, where we explore truth, beauty, and goodness through meaningful conversation. We invite you to join us in discussions meant to edify your mind, encourage your heart, and equip your family to live abundantly in Christ.
Welcome back to Cultivate, everyone. Today, I am going to be talking with Walt Mueller. Walt is from the CPYU, Center for Parent Youth Understanding. Did
That's
you get
good.
that right?
You got it.
Wow. And today we're going to be giving you a bit of an insight into youth culture. This podcast got titled Youth Culture 101. We're doing it a little bit to induce you to come out to Veritas Academy November 19th at 7 p.m. because Walt's going to be here talking about youth culture at that time. Walt and I have known each other for a long time. He's so encouraging to me. We go to the same church, and he's really encourages me to come to worship, especially because I come a few minutes later than him, and it keeps all of the intention.
You
off
make
of
us
his
look
family.
good. You make us look good.
That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm trying to do. So, Walt, before we jump into talking about youth culture, tell us, what is the Center for Parent Youth Understanding, and how did you get involved?
Yeah.
This is not like there's no franchise of this.
No.
It's a one of a kind, right?
Yeah, and I had no plans to do this. I was a youth pastor working in a church outside Philadelphia. This was after my years.
You mean
in
the
seminary.
Gospels made it all the way to Philadelphia?
Oh yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Don't make fun of Philly. I mean, that's where I'm from. So, but I was working at a church
Now,
there.
everything makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, now you understand me.
Yeah.
So I'm at a church there. We are working very hard to help the parents understand that they're the ones who are primarily responsible for the spiritual nurture of their kids. And so we had good relationships with them, and they could come and ask us anything, and we relied on them a lot. And I had a group of parents come to me in the late 1980s, and they said, hey, we have a problem we need to talk to you about. I mean, you're a school administrator, so you know when
Sure.
a parent comes and says, we have a problem, you automatically think it's you.
Yes.
I don't know. That's the way I was.
Well, generally it is me, though.
That was the case back there in Philadelphia, but they said this time it's not you.
Oh, wow.
But I think that, they thought it was a problem I could help them with, and they said, we know we're responsible to nurture our kids, but they're growing up in a really different world than the one we grew up in. Can you help us understand that world? You're with them. And while we had worked with parents intentionally, I was much younger, but I much preferred to be with the students. Parents standing in front of them and teaching made me a little bit nervous.
Okay.
But I thought, you asked, I have to say yes to this. So my background was in sociology and anthropology, so I loved culture. I loved
you're one of those
studying culture.
people.
Yeah, I was. And so I said, you know what, let's get together. We'll get together once a week. It was an adult education class on Sunday morning for 12 weeks. And each week I would, pour out what I knew about one aspect of culture and give them practical insights. And it wasn't teaching them how to parent. It was teaching them to understand this is the cultural context of your kids.
Wow.
And the class grew, which was the topic.
Okay.
They found it helpful. And they would come back week after week and say, hey, we had great conversations about things that matter with our kids from a biblical perspective. I was afraid the students would come back and say, hey, you're selling us out. We thought you were our friend. Why are you peeling back the curtain on, our world? But they came back and they said, this has been helpful.
You found they came to you with a felt need, and you started scratching, and they said, oh, that's right where we're itching.
Yeah, and it was helpful, and it was a surprise. But then people would hear about it. We actually had people coming to our church on Sunday morning for the education hour from other churches, and then going back to because the parents would talk amongst themselves.
They were
in
cheating.
The community. Yeah,
they were cheating.
But they came
in Sunday school.
There was a need, and so Lisa's my wife. We spent a lot of time talking about this, and at one point I said, "Do you think this is a need that we could meet? Like, could God be calling us to do this?" And so for a year, I was praying through this. She was convinced this is what I needed to do. I took the road of consulting older, wiser people, asking them questions about this, and they all said, yeah, go for it. This is needed, so do it. So we began We incorporated as a nonprofit donor-supported ministry back in the summer of 1989, and in 1990 we launched full-time. So it's been about 35 years of doing this, and I will say it's getting more and more difficult because the culture is so diverse right now.
Yeah.
It's globalized.
No, well, is there even a culture?
Well,
Yeah,
I
like
would
it's
say
kind of
yes, yeah.
atomized in some ways.
It has, and that's a good question because when we got started, I would talk about things like music and media. MTV was a big deal, but it was all the music. Everybody was listening to the same thing.
Correct.
Everyone was listening to the same thing. We're in a globalized youth culture now with the internet. Everybody is listening to something different, and they're all making it too. They're content producers. So we can't keep up with that. But what I like about your question is it's insightful in the sense that we now talk about some of the bigger macro trends that are underlying what we see.
Okay.
So,
because it's not like when I think that besides the NFL, which is one thing that you can pretty much count on a lot of people coming into the office on Monday and knowing that they're going to talk about the NFL. The Cosby Show, I think, is the last. It's the last vestige of like a unified culture. Because I can remember going into school, talking with teachers and students, because we had all watched the Cosby Show the night before. That doesn't happen anymore.
No. In fact, it's interesting. I had a conversation. I saw my brother-in-law over the weekend, and we were watching a football game, and commercials were coming on for these new network shows that were coming on, these dramas. And I looked at him, I said, I don't watch any of this anymore.
Yeah.
I don't watch one network show.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right about that, Ty. I mean, it's just changed a lot.
Yeah. Well,
Very different.
and let's go then to so basically you started learning youth culture because honestly, as a youth pastor, you were learning it because the people that were right in front of you wanted to connect with them.
Yeah.
Okay. But you've had to just keep on learning because the darn thing moves around, doesn't it? It doesn't sit still.
Yeah, it's changing rapidly. And I mean, I tell people all the time, I'll do my best for you. We'll do our best with our staff, and we have a group of research fellows that we send out, and they kind of survey things and work on producing resources for parents. And really, what we always want to do is we don't just look at the culture to know the culture. We look at the culture to ask questions of the culture and say, now, how does the gospel speak to that?
Yeah.
What is a biblical worldview? Can we, from a biblical perspective, can we celebrate and affirm certain things that are happening in the culture? And sometimes that happens.
Sure.
All truth is God's truth, and so where you see it, you celebrate it. But at the same time, we challenge culture more often than not. And we're finding that most of our work is with youth pastors and parents. We do work with educators as well, and pastors and counselors. But we're finding that most parents, at this point, they're oblivious to what's happening in the culture.
Yeah.
And when they start to figure it out, they're not sure how to connect the dots between what's happening in the culture and what they're called to teach to their kids. And so we're working to stand in the gap, equip them to be cross-cultural missionaries who can speak truth to the realities that exist.
Boy, that makes me want to come to Veritas on November 19th at 7 p.m.
I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, so you might come too?
Yeah.
We hope you will. So let's go back to a moment because, I kind of, at Veritas Academy, there's BC before COVID,
right.
and then there's AC after COVID.
Yeah.
So what has changed about youth culture since that COVID moment?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I'm going to guess you and your teachers could answer that better than I can because you're watching the students and you're in touch with the families.
I bet my teachers could.
Yeah, from my perspective, I do think it ramped up things that were already there in terms of an inability among our kids because we haven't equipped them well to handle stress and anxiety.
Yes.
And I've thought as the culture has changed, Ed Welch at Christian Counseling Education Foundation, he and David Pallison were very helpful to me as I listened to them teach on anxiety, that one of the things that's happened in our culture, and this was before COVID, is that the normal stresses and strains of life have now become in people's minds insurmountable.
Yes.
And so kids are, they talk the language. I'm anxious. I'm stressed. I mean, we never talked about that when I was a kid.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things we didn't talk about when I was a kid, but we never talked about that. We just learned you kind of suck it up and you handle these things. Or if it's overbearing, you go to the Lord and just trust the Lord to carry you through. You lean into the promises. And now it seems like it's just epidemic.
It's almost paralyzing.
Yeah, it is, which is interesting because prior to COVID, I was reading about and hearing about more and more high-achieving students in schools. And It doesn't matter what kind of school, but, like AP level kids who are taking the top classes, who when I was in high school, those were the kids I wish I was.
Yes.
Right? I'm looking at them going, oh, man, those guys are smart.
They got it all together.
Yeah, they've got it all together. They were paralyzed. They weren't getting out of bed and coming to school. And schools were having to learn how to deal with these kids who were paralyzed by anxiety, who you would think in your mind could come in to the building and just be super successful, like not a worry or a care in the world, as opposed to.
So what's causing that paralysis? How did we get from the my kids? Sometimes I have my water bottle over here, and I tell them, I would drink out of a water hose most of the summer.
Oh yeah,
and they're like, "Oh, Mr. Fisher, you're alive? You're
a better man than me because I drink out of a pond."
There you go.
Like in my neighborhood,
but I'm like, oh man, the people are worried and concerned about things, and I'm like, man, what happened? What caused that? Yeah, I'm asking you to solve all the problems.
It's interesting. I'll tell you who's been really helpful on that is a social psychologist. You might be familiar with Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, who wrote the book, The Coddling of the American Mind.
Oh, yes.
And so they talk about some of the big lies that we've been led to believe, and one of them is, what doesn't kill you will hurt you, as opposed to what doesn't kill you will make you stronger.
Yep.
And the basic sense is that parents started to believe a lot that was in the news about predators and kidnappings. And, I was just talking to a group of youth workers this morning about vulnerability of kids. And ever since I was little, parents would say, don't take candy from strangers.
Sure.
Because kids, believe what an adult says. But somehow we came to believe that the world was a lot meaner than it actually was. Sin is present. Kids get kidnapped. Bad things happen. There's no doubt about it. But that stuff became so prevalent in the news with the 24/7 news cycle that parents started to, sort of pull their kids in just to protect them rather than allowing them to engage in the normal kid-like stuff that we used to do that builds resilience.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting. Haidt would say this. I thought this was great. It was a great subject. Sometimes we just need to let our kids fall out of a tree.
Yes.
Because that's what I saw your tree. Don't climb it. I didn't climb in the tree on the way in, by the way. So
that would be kind of transgressive.
Yeah. And I mean, you can get hurt doing that, but kids, that's what it's like when you work out, you stretch everything, you hurt everything, and it heals up, you become resilient. And so kids have lost resilience. And I also think it's a generation of parents that maybe were parented a little funny on that as well.
Yes.
The parents now were the kids in my youth group back then that,
So it's your fault.
It is. Okay. It's all, place it all at the feet of youth ministry. That's where it is.
You heard it here, folks.
Yeah, so I think we've lost that sense of resilience. But I think since COVID, it's just ramped up. And
so that was kind of a catalyst
to
cause everything to kind of flame up.
And here's, this is interesting because when the government picks up on something that we would agree with them on and would say this is an issue and a problem and would cite some of the same things as being causal factors, that's good news in the sense that they agree with this, and people are starting to wake up. But at the end of August, I don't know if you saw, the Surgeon General put out an advisory report about parents, mental health, stress, and anxiety in parents.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And when you read that, one of the things that the Surgeon General says in the foreword, which is 2 pages, and they have one call out, one sentence, and it's to the effect of parenting is sacred work, which I read that and I'm going, this is awesome that people are starting to notice this. And
so there was a great revival at the Surgeon General's
I don't know
office?
if that's happened, but at least they're sounding the alarm, and parents are starting to understand they need to parent and parent better. And we've all made mistakes, right? I mean, Yeah, but so I think that some of that is safetyism is a word that's come up, that we've been very concerned about the safety of our kids. We don't let them out. But the other thing is they're staying in because they're playing video games. They're not going out to play. There were actually laws in some states that prohibited parents from letting their kids walk 2 blocks home from school.
Yes.
And the state of Utah, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, enacted a law that made it legal for free play, for kids to go out and just play. They made it legal, not illegal. They made it legal, trying to push kids to go out and do that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot
and
that's come together.
That's one of those things that I've noticed the creep of this over time, that, when I was younger, if you would have asked my father, where is your son?
Yeah.
He would have said, do you have a map?
Yeah.
And he would have circled an area and said, he's somewhere in
Yeah.
this 5-mile radius, and I have no idea
Yeah.
where he is.
Yeah.
You should start checking the baseball fields and the basketball courts
Yeah.
in this area. Whereas now, I remember it was a beautiful summer day, I think in June. This was probably 10 years ago. And I had to drive through a neighborhood, and I thought, oh, the kids will all be out. Nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, where are these people?
I grew up in a neighborhood outside of Philadelphia, and kids everywhere. We would come home from school. We would immediately get into our play clothes, and we would head outside, and our mothers would all tell us, don't come home till you hear the whistle at 5 o'clock. The local fire departments would test their whistles at noon and at 5, and those were our signals to come home. And they just knew we were out there somewhere. And it's not that they were irresponsible. It was just that we had learned how to tend to ourselves,
So let's talk a little bit about youth culture and technology. What would your advice be for Christian parents and for Christian communities that are seeking to navigate the issues with children, teens, and young adults concerning technology?
Yeah. That's a good question. We started about 15, 16 years ago now what we call a Digital Kids Initiative, and it started because I would be speaking on youth culture, and a break would come, in an evening or a Saturday, or I would end, and there would always be 1 or 2 moms, because they tended to be the ones that were most concerned, who would come up and say, hey, my kid's telling me they're the last kid on the face of the earth to not get a phone.
Right.
What do you suggest? When should a child get a smartphone or just a phone? I'd say, I don't know. And so we figured, okay, this is something in the soup of youth culture. We have to figure this out. So we started this Digital Kids Initiative. I would say, as we've looked at this, and we're still trying to figure it out, I would say to parents, avoid 2 extremes.
Okay.
All right? The one extreme is, we're just going to put it in their hands because everybody else has it, and we're going to trust them to learn how to use this.
Yeah.
That is a recipe for disaster.
Okay.
It was probably New Jersey about 1.5 years ago now, and I did an evening on technology, and then we had time for questions and comments. This was at a church, and a couple was sitting right in the aisle. I can still see them in my mind's eye, and the dad raised his hand. He said, I don't have a question, I have a comment. He said, last year...
Well, that's honest, at least.
Yeah. And I was getting a little worried then. But he said, last year, we put a smartphone in the hands of our 10-year-old daughter because we thought we were going to make her life better and safer.
Wow.
And he said, we have realized now, 1 year later, we put an even greater danger in her hands. And there's just... Look, I think about my 12-year-old self, my 14-year-old self, my 16-year-old self. I would not have been able to handle it with what kids can access, and as a guy, even with pornography and that out there, I mean, I just think what kind of young man or older man would I be?
Yeah.
Based on, because I say all the time, culture's catechizing our kids 24/7. You put a phone in a kid's hands without any borders and boundaries and trust nature to take its course. And it's a recipe for disaster. I mean, just think about this. Kids, I think we're up about 97 to 98% of kids either have their own smartphone or access to smartphone. And that's teenagers. When you get younger, there's 8, 9-year-olds. I picked up my grandson a couple of years ago coming out of first grade out in Cumberland County. I was there to pick him up. And, of course, talk about safetyism. I had to jump through all kinds of hoops to have a special sign in the window. This is Maverick's grandfather. And anyway, pick him up. And I just wait. They're letting the kids out one by one.
You passed the blood test.
Yeah.
They took your
did all
DNA
that.
sample.
Yes, that's exactly what was needed. So the kids are coming out one at a time. He does not have a phone. I'm watching first, second, and third graders walk out of that building. As soon as they walk out, they've got their eyes down on a device in their hand. They're just walking, not looking up, and I'm thinking, wow, this is unbelievable. Sleeping with phones. So it's most kids who have phones will sleep with their phones, and I tell parents, get them out of there, because anxiety, stress, if you don't, kids need 9 hours and 15 minutes of uninterrupted sleep for healthy growth and development. And if they're not getting that, it's undoing them. And so this epidemic of anxiety and stress, some of it is caused by the fact that they're not sleeping.
By sleeplessness.
Yeah, sleeplessness.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've got kids like that in the school who are coming in and they're tired because they're not sleeping. So parents have to get the phones out. So, okay, so that's the one extreme. We're just going to let them go. The other one is they're not going near that because it's just evil stuff. Now, the problem with that is you can hold them to that, and they're going to be released into the adult world, and you have not given them the background and the training on how to use these things.
When they're 18 years old,
When
they'll be
they're 18,
asking for track shoes and starting blocks because they're going to run away as quick as they can.
You're right. That could be it. So what we say is, all right, let's ease into this, start to teach them about technology when they're young, but you don't have to put the device in their hands. Now, in answer to the question, when do you put it in their hands? The recommendation that most people I'm listening to now that I think is very smart is no smartphone with social media or internet access. That's what a smartphone is.
Sure.
Before the age of 16.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is brain development, what it does to the way God made our brains.
Have you read The Anxious Generation?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So that's one of the places where I found...
That's Jonathan Haidt. Yeah.
Oh, that's Jonathan
yeah,
Haidt. It was so interesting to really look at, and I mean, the stuff on boys was really tough.
Yeah.
I thought it was even worse for girls.
Oh, the girls.
Yeah.
It's off the charts.
I was like, no wonder we're seeing all of these weird problems because they're not even living in the world anymore. They're living in this place where if you have a problem with your friend, there's nowhere, when you and I got sideways with a friend, we would go home. And then at least we knew, we're at home, we're away from that. Especially in those 13, 14, 15-year-olds. And, that's one of the things as a community we're really talking about here at Veritas is how can we as a community stand together or make some commitments? Because
it makes it easier for everybody.
It does. That was one of the things that said in the book that I was really moved by was if everybody's on the same page, then that fear of missing out, which drives a lot of girls into being connected to social media all the time, it's not gone, but it's greatly diminished when they know that their friends you're not missing out on anything.
Yeah. It's interesting when you bring that up about the girls. In 2023, so a year ago, the Surgeon General issued an advisory, and when they preface these advisories by saying it is a really important social concern, we have an issue. It's bad.
Yeah.
It's like waving a flag saying, slow down, the road's out ahead. And the advisory was on kids and mental health and social media. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of talk about girls. Obviously, as you said, it's not good for our guys. But for the girls, it's even worse because they're so social and they're living so deeply on social media. The comparison that takes place, the body dysmorphia, the self-mutilation. I even hate talking about that.
Sure.
Like cutting. And so the comparison drives them to be emotionally fragile, and then they learn on the internet these inappropriate coping mechanisms, whether it's a disordered eating situation or whatever. And their parents don't know. There's tutorials on there on how to do this stuff. They learn. There's whole communities where these kids live. It's like their church community where they're living in this, and it's bad.
And it's they're living in a community where if some of these people came over to your house, you wouldn't let them in your house.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But they're in your child's bedroom, catechizing them on how to harm themselves.
And some of them are not peers. They're adults.
That's correct.
They're adults that are doing this. And so, and this is where I go back to that father and that mother, the man who said that about my 10-year-old daughter. She was exposed to things that were, not just sinful and wrong, but entirely inappropriate in terms of a cognitive maturation level for a kid to be able to handle that.
Sure.
And we say this all the time. whoever speaks first to a young person about anything has set the bar for truth. And this is where, like with sexuality, I mean, parents are uneasy about talking about some of these things with 2, 3, and 4-year-olds. Fortunately, there are some good materials that are coming out now from a Christian perspective that are helpful for that, children's books and things.
That are appropriate.
They're appropriate.
To the age.
Yeah, they're appropriate and helpful because it makes it a little easier for us as parents to talk about it, because most of us were not talked to about it well ourselves when we were growing up. But we have to talk about it because we have to set the bar for truth rather than the culture. Because if we go then, when they're older and offer God's good order and design for sexuality and gender, they're going to question it if they've heard all this other stuff. So we want to set the bar.
They're not coming in tabula rasa. The blackboard is full of words already.
Yeah, it is.
So what are some of the well-meaning things that parents do that actually end up being hurtful? I mean, you've already mentioned, here's your cell phone for kindergarten, take that.
Right. And I like the way you say well-meaning, because there are a lot of things we do that are well-intentioned.
Yes.
We think this is going to lead to the end that it needs to be. And I think sometimes, because you gave me this question beforehand, I was thinking about it. And so I think putting them in tons and tons of activities and laying expectations on them that are unrealistic for human beings, let alone kids a certain age, way too much pressure. So I talk to parents a lot. A lot of my talking is with people who are high achievers, people of means, and people who are well-intentioned about what they want for their kids. And I tell them, here are 3 things to really watch out for, and these are prevalent in the church. One is unrealistic academic pressure.
Okay.
Because only 1 or 2 people are going to graduate from the top of the class here.
Yeah.
And
so that 1 or 2 people, we have a famous story here at Veritas. I had a young lady who came to me and I said, "What are you thinking about doing after you graduate?" And she said, "I'm not really sure." And I said, "You thinking about going to college?" She said, "Oh, I'm not going to college." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Well, I'm not smart." And I said, "Who told you that you're not smart?" And she said, "Well, I'm not as smart as
comparison.
This girl."
Yep.
Like Monica McGrath was the girl's name. Monica had the highest average grade in the history of our school. And I said, that's really not a great standard.
Right.
And this to use for whether you're smart or not. This young lady did end up going to college, and she sent me a note and said, "I'm the smartest one here." Maybe you were right. Maybe the standard, that's not a great standard to use to judge yourself.
Right. Yeah. This is what Veritas is about, and our kids need to know that God's given them brains. They need to develop their brains.
Sure.
And a brain that's set on seeing the heart growth in faith, and they need to do their best.
Right.
And sometimes we as parents, we believe that our value hinges on how my child achieves. And if my child doesn't achieve well, that's a reflection on me. And
can you make an idol out of your child?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's where I'm going with this. And again, expect them to do their best.
But God's okay when you make an idol out of your child, isn't he?
No. But here's the thing: we all do it, right? So there's academics. I also talk about athletic pressure because that's off the charts right now.
Yes.
Hey, Ty, listen. When we joke about being late for worship, but when we go to the early service at church down at Westminster, we come from Elizabeth down 283. We pass the Nook.
Oh yeah.
The big.
I think they have services there on Sundays sometimes.
And man, that parking lot is backed up. It is unbelievable. And I say to Lisa, look at all these people and how much they're spending time and money on their kids. And all 4 of my kids did athletics, and one went on to play in college. And it's not like there was never any sense that these kids are going to be professionals or that.
But every kid is going to be a professional now.
In a parent's mind.
Yes, that's true.
And I coached baseball, and I sat down with the parents, and I told them at the beginning of the year, none of your kids are going to be pros, except mine. No, I didn't say that, but I said none of your kids are going to go on to play professionally. I'm reasonably sure of that. And
Yeah.
it didn't happen. So I was a little nervous after I said that, but we're gonna be here to learn, try hard, and have fun.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. And, I mean, and this is where I think with academics and athletics, we need to learn, those are forms of worship.
Yes.
And we develop our abilities and we do our best, but we can't worship the sport. We can't worship our kids in the sport, as you say. So the other one I would say, and this one's a little more insidious, I think, appearance pressure.
Unpack that.
Well, because I just think we live in a culture right now that worships youth. Mm-hmm. And we're swimming in that soup of culture that worships youth ourselves, and we can marinate in that, and that can influence us in ways that we don't even imagine. And, when you look at how much money we spend now on outward adornment, trying to make ourselves look younger, non-surgically required plastic surgery or cosmetic surgery, and there's a theological reality there we're fighting against, and that is the brokenness of sin, death, physical. Time and gravity are not kind to the human body. And I think, we have to realize that. And sometimes I think we push our kids to look a certain way, and it's not always what we say, it's what we do to ourselves as well.
We kind of want to give the impression to people that we have everything together.
Oh, yeah.
When the Bible says the opposite of that.
Right.
If we had everything together, we wouldn't need Jesus.
And we don't want to get old, right?
Sure.
Nobody wants to get old. Nobody aspires to
Well, I'm
be young.
thankful
You
that
get
you
old
and I
not
aren't
yet.
aging at all.
That's right. Yeah. Well, that's another story. But So again, I think that's another way we put pressure on our kids.
So we're making our kids anxious sometimes
Yeah.
by that pressure that we're putting
Yeah.
on them to excel in all of these areas.
Can I mention one more
Yeah,
thing
please,
that
please.
we do? And this is related to technology and social media because we live our lives out on social media now.
Yeah.
And this is where I think we just need to be, as parents, we need to be quiet and tell our kids how pleased we are when they do well and tell them we're proud, but we don't have to put them out there for everybody to see.
Yes.
Because here's what happens. If you have 3 kids, you're going to have one that's pretty smart, and that kid's going to be out there all the time. Or one that's really athletic, that kid's going to be out there all the time. You're saying to that kid that my willingness to be pleased with you and my pride in you is contingent on your achievements.
Yes.
But the one who's not getting posted, they're realizing they're hearing another message.
Sure.
And I just think social media ramps that up. We've got to be really careful about that.
So I guess we're always teaching, aren't we? Yeah.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
always teaching. And when this is one of those things, and I think my wife definitely understands this better. I think even my daughters understand this better than I do. Everything's connected to everything else.
It is.
Right? This causes communication problems sometimes with myself and the other members of my family because I say something and they're like, that means this. And I'm like, actually, it doesn't. It just means I'm hungry. It just means that. When you're posting this person over and over again, it's sending a message to this other person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just think social media, look, it's a. I
know
always
if-
think what Tim Keller always says, the good things, when they become ultimate things, they become idols.
Yes.
And I just think it's so easy to misuse, and it really is like gasoline on the fire of our human depravity and our pride.
So, but really as parents, that is an area, those are areas where we're trying to maybe idolatrously cause them or at least make them appear to be successful.
Yes.
When really a lot of what parenting is helping them to understand how to fail,
Yes.
how to fall down and get back up, how to grow up, how to explore the world. So I talk sometimes with my administration here at Veritas and say, how can we sell parents on failure?
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about how can we as parents take a better view of trying to help our kids learn that resilience.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, theologically speaking, I think we need to have a more robust theology of our brokenness and sin. Because if we don't have a robust theology of our brokenness and sin, we don't understand the depth of God's grace. And we tend to rely on ourselves so much. I think we can overpraise our kids out of an understanding of their sinfulness, and I don't think that's really helpful. Like we said, Lisa and I, there are so many things we do different. We have 4 kids. They're all adults. We have 7 grandkids now, and if we could go back, there's so many things we would do different, but I do know that we pray. We knew our kids were sinners just like us. We prayed that the unique bents of their depravity would be exposed while they're in our home, because then we can deal with it. And God answered those prayers.
But praise the Lord.
But it was helpful for that to happen. And in those moments, everything feels like it's crushing down on you, but we were able to work through it. And we were able to have those important conversations about grace and forgiveness and repentance and restoration and taking responsibility for the decisions that you've made. And that's another thing we do. Bailing our kids out, don't bail them out.
Well, and
don't bail them out.
It's one of those things that, sometimes in a disciplinary situation here at school, and I'm not, if I'm involved in the disciplinary situation,
it's bad.
It's pretty bad.
Yeah. In
the old days, I was a lot more involved personally.
Yeah.
And, there would be times when you could just see that parents were aching that something had been exposed. And I'm like, hey, this is like a lot better now.
Oh, yeah.
A lot better now. So your son cheated on a test.
Yeah.
They're going to
learn the lesson now.
There are going to be consequences for that. He could be an accountant for Enron.
Yeah.
And that's going to go a lot worse than what's going to happen to him here.
And that's one of the best lessons a student can leave Veritas with.
Yes.
Those life lessons. And parents need to come alongside. I mean, that's a change. If I got in trouble if I did something wrong in my neighborhood growing up, I knew 3 things would happen. I knew that the person whose house I was at, their parents, that mother or that dad was going to really come after me. The second thing was I knew they were going to call my parents.
Yeah.
And on my walk home, I knew the third thing was waiting for me when I got home.
Yes.
And nobody back then was saying, what? My son would never do anything like that.
Yes.
And that's where I say, parents, look, I know there's injustice out there, but it's in a good situation like this, it has got to be rare. Just sit and listen and join with whoever it is, whether it's a coach, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a school administrator, whether it's law enforcement. Yeah. Sit on the side and get the lesson across.
Yeah. So what are some of the best ways when we think about, sometimes, especially with teenagers, it's a challenge just for parents to communicate with them. What are some of the best things that parents can do to keep those paths of communication open? So sometimes my daughters would give me quizzes for pop culture, and I knew Taylor Swift, and then the next 19 people I did not know. And, it makes them want to fall over. Many of us are not going to start our own Center for Parent Youth Understanding, but how do we keep those paths of communication open?
Yeah. Well, one practical thing is when, eat your meals together and don't have your smartphones at the table. Mm-hmm. And another one would be if there's a place in the house or times in the house where nobody's with their phones, you're with each other. I would also say, very practically speaking, get rid of a lot of the borders and boundaries from good communication that come through technology, like everyone having a television in their room.
Yes.
If you're going to have a TV in the house, have one TV.
Yeah.
And talk about what you're seeing and hearing. So more practically speaking, I think admitting your ignorance, being self-deprecating about your ignorance about what's going on in the world of kids, and asking lots of questions.
Okay.
So I was just talking to a group of youth workers this morning, and I said, so you got a kid who's jumping into some sort of ideology that is dangerous, you don't know much about it. Ask certain questions like, how have you come to your conclusions? Who told you that? How's that working for you? Huh. These are the kinds of questions you just ask, the other thing would be if you have a concern about some of the things we read about related to peer pressure, whether it's drugs, alcohol, sexuality, online gambling now, that sort of thing. Instead of, I found that sometimes going to your kids and instead of saying, are you online gambling? Are you online gambling?
No, I'm not.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, you get that look. What I would say is, hey, I'm watching these commercials, and it seems like everywhere they're advertising online gambling. I can't watch a Phillies game without being told these are the odds for this right in the middle of the game. Instead of saying, do you do that? Say, what percentage of your peers do you think are engaged in this? And what they're going to do is they're going to give you their sense. I mean, they'll be honest, I think, about what their sense is of how many. And if it's pretty high, they're feeling that pressure.
Yes.
So then you can start to talk through some of those things. But I think questions are really, really important. And just keep your ears open. Like when you're in the car and you have the radio on, if you get a newspaper, if you're looking at online news and you see things pop up about trends, ask about it.
Okay.
Just ask about it.
So keeping that open questioning kind of attitude instead of the catechetical attitude of you're asking a question, but you already know the answer.
Yeah. And eventually you're going to get to the truth.
Yeah.
You're making the soil, you're tilling the soil to be fertile for good teaching. And
you're going to be additionally blessed if they get to the truth.
Yeah.
Right? If they're able to put it together.
Yeah.
So when you think about church communities and school communities, how can we as a community bless the lives of youth and children in our community without overstepping those bounds and becoming, legalistic or being the kind of people that kids would want to run away from? Sometimes you see a community that's wound so tight that you're like, man, it's oppressive. And no one wants to live in a community like that. Yeah. Some do. It's not really.
I can tell you what we did with a church youth group and how this worked. And it worked well. I've shared this with lots of youth workers who do this now. For starters, you have your school here and you're working with parents, or what's a church and working with parents. I let them know, first off, I'm on your side. And we share a love for your kids. We have something in common here. And in a church situation, Christian school situation, we have a shared love for the Lord. We have a shared love for our kids. So we want to see the best. I also would communicate to them that I'm not going to always believe what your kids tell me about you, and I don't want you to believe what they tell you about me. If you have a concern, let's come and talk. And so we did a lot of communicating. We would meet together all the time. And then we just worked as we knew we weren't the parents, but we can support parents.
Yes.
We do this at CPYU now. Resources, they're all for churches, youth workers, schools. Hand those to parents and support your parents. Make them aware of what's going on, and then, work together on that. And so, look, kids are always going to push back, right?
Really?
Yeah, they're always going to push back, but you know what? I think of a lot of that as a stage. Someone once said, I don't know who it was, said, like what you say to a kid when they're 15, sound travels slowly. What you say to a kid when they're 15, they don't hear till they're 25.
Yes.
It could be 35 or 40 now. I don't know.
Twain said something like, I when I was 15 years old, I couldn't imagine how stupid my father was.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much he learned by the time I was 25.
Oh, yeah. He also said when a child turns 12, you put him in a barrel, feed him through a knothole, and when he turns 16, you plug the hole. But that's not always a great.
I think
that was Mark Twain.
I think the police are coming.
Yeah. Don't climb in the tree.
Yeah. So, Walt, one of the things that we wanted to touch upon here, we have parents that fall out on all different kinds of spectrums between permissive and tight, and sometimes they change over time. But many times we'll see parents who might say that Veritas is the treatment they're using to keep their kids away from the bad things in culture. And unapologetically, we want to do that, especially when they're younger.
Yes.
But as they get older, here at school, we're trying to prepare them to be ready to step out into the culture as it is right now and to cling to Christ as they step out. What would you say to parents who are like, what do you mean? Like, these problems aren't going to be close to us because, our kids go to a Christian school.
Yeah.
And they're in church on Sundays, by the way, Walt.
And I got grandkids in Christian school. I worked with Christian school kids. The reality is that's really naive to think that.
Yeah.
Because wherever there are people, there is culture. And you have to understand that. And the mainstream culture is the mainstream culture because it's out there in the mainstream and it hits everybody. And sometimes I think we feel safe putting our kids in a situation like Veritas thinking, okay, and then now I can sleep at night. No, your kids are as broken as other kids in terms of sin and depravity. They're going to struggle with the same temptations, and we have to be just as diligent regardless of where they're going to school. Because what can happen is we fall asleep.
Yes.
And things happen under our nose and we don't even see it or realize it. It's there.
And
it's there.
And if your child has a cell phone, the
yeah.
cell phones at Veritas don't connect to a different internet.
No.
Or different social
Yeah.
media
Yeah.
than other places. So
Yeah.
thanks. As we're looking forward to November 19th, talk a little bit about some of the stuff that maybe you're going to be addressing there so that as we head toward that time, parents can make good decisions about being there.
Well, I hope parents come out. You know, one of the things I'll do is I work very hard to help you see some of the big, I would call them mantras in today's youth culture, things that kids are being led to believe, either stated directly or just, kind of woven in and through everything, the values and the attitudes that then guide the behaviors. But I'll talk a lot about how culture functions in their lives. I mean, just that last question you asked, no kid is immune, and we can't fall asleep on it. You're here to assist them, and that's a wonderful, beautiful thing with the church, with the youth group. But together we recognize that kids are, they have to navigate this culture, and how they learn to navigate it now is going to be how they navigate it for the rest of their lives. And so we're going to look at some of the big ideas in youth culture and look at the way the scriptures speak to that and how to have conversations and push back on those things, because it's a process.
So you look into the mirror of Galadriel in the Lord of the Rings, like where you look into it and you see some things that are real, some things that might be real, and some things that aren't. You look into a pretty dark mirror sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
So what can you say to parents who might be, sometimes I see parents that are just kind of giving way to despair about this.
I think about this all the time that, God is, right? God is. So God is in control. God is all powerful. And as long as we breathe, we have great hope. When you go through difficult things in dark times, we have friends at Westminster who were going through a pretty dark time, and someone said to them, look, right now, this is God's curriculum for you.
Yeah.
And God parents us as we parent our kids, as long as we're here. That's why we long for eternity, right?
Right.
Creation, fall, redemption, we're in this in-between time, and we have great hope, and we have the joy of the Lord, but we also look forward to that time that we read about in the latter chapters of the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
No more tears, no more crying, no more death, no more despair.
That's a good note to end on. So, Walt, thank you for coming for the podcast, and we look forward to your visit on November 19th at 7 p.m. here at Veritas Academy. So remember, folks, if you like the Cultivate podcast, remember to like the Cultivate podcast on any place where you get your podcasts, and it's always great when you leave a recommendation. So it was great having Walt in today, and like I said, we look forward to November 19th.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. If you'd like to learn more about Veritas, visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.